I've attended a lot of interviews. I've helped prepare a lot of people for interviews, and these are some frequently asked questions based on their feedback. So you want to watch this video to the end to answer some of these questions alongside me. The fifth question, which probably you might be asked, is your experience with continuous integration and continuous deployment on the AWS cloud, or have you constructed or have you built a continuous integration and a continuous deployment system or setup in the AWS cloud? There are given set of CI/CD tools for AWS. These CI/CD tools range from you managing source code from developers to you deploying your application to the end users. So if you're talking about AWS CI/CD tools, first you want to talk about AWS Code Commit, where you've set up an AWS Code Commit repository to manage source code or as a version control system between your application developers and the AWS code repository, where the developers finish their code and then they send it to the AWS source code. So after you set up your repositories, you want to talk about AWS Elastic Container Registry, because once the source code comes to the AWS cloud, you're definitely going to perform a build on that code where you have final images. So AWS ECR gives you the opportunity to store images of your application on the AWS cloud, same as maybe you have a Docker Hub where you can store finally built images on the Docker Hub. You want to talk about the AWS Code Commit for your raw source code file and the Elastic Container Registry service for your built images. After you've performed your build and you have the built images, you want to mention the AWS developer tools. The AWS developer tools are specific tools that make the CI/CD process complete. We have the AWS Code Build, which enables you to perform build on your application source code, and there are several sources that AWS Code Build uses. AWS can use code commits for your source file. AWS can use Bitbucket or S3 and a lot other technologies for source building. So mention AWS Code Build as a build server on the AWS cloud. For the continuous deployment, we have the AWS Elastic Container Service. We are talking maybe of a blue-green deployment or of a rollout deployment, or normal, the default deployment is the rolling out deployment, and there are other engines which you can use for deployment. So for CI/CD, you mention your experience with code commit, ECR, code build, code deploy for deploying application code, and finally you mention the AWS code pipeline, which builds an integration pipeline between the build code from code build and the deployed application with code deploy. So that gives a summary experience of your usage of AWS tools for continuous integration and for continuous deployment. Again, we have AWS Code Commit for management of source code, AWS Elastic Container Registry for management of built images, AWS Code Build for building application files, AWS Code Deploy for deploying built application, and AWS Code Pipeline for building the complete integration pipeline. So that's a summary of the usage of AWS services for continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now the next question is, how will you monitor your infrastructure on AWS? There are two key services which you should mention: CloudWatch and CloudTrail. So CloudWatch first gives you the ability to monitor the entire AWS environment or specific resources and to display these resources using dashboards with CloudWatch, or dashboards to set up alarms that can be integrated with other services like simple notification service, and equally to log current events in your environment with CloudWatch log groups. CloudWatch helps you to monitor your entire environment. We have CloudTrail that helps you to monitor all API calls made to your applications. So you want to mention CloudTrail for monitoring of API calls made to different services in your AWS account, maybe from different users or from different roles. You're talking about CloudWatch and CloudTrail for monitoring of your infrastructure on the AWS cloud. Now, the next question which you can probably ask is, what services will you use to ensure the deployment of microservice applications on AWS cloud, and why will you use those services? They want to know how you want to deploy microservices, because before we used to have monolithic applications and now we have microservice applications. So what service will you use to ensure microservice application deployment on the AWS cloud? And now, once you're being asked about microservice, key services that should come to your mind, we have the AWS Elastic Container Service, we have the AWS Kubernetes Service, and we have the AWS API Gateways. So for AWS Container Service, it's like AWS Containerized Management Service, where you can manage your container applications using service and task. When you define your tasks, you use container images to perform orchestration of your microservice applications on the AWS cloud. We equally have the AWS Elastic Kubernetes Service, the EKS, which is AWS native Kubernetes service on the cloud. And with your AWS community service, you can configure your node groups, you can configure your nodes, you can configure your, of course, you configure your cluster, the various deployments which you have, some Kubernetes add-ons, and your log groups and networking and all of that. That is the next microservice. And lastly, we also have the API gateway. An API gateway is another service which you can use to ensure the smooth functioning of a microservice application on the AWS cloud. So if you are being asked to mention microservice application deployments on AWS, the very first things that should come to your mind, we have the Elastic Container Service and the Elastic Kubernetes Service and the AWS API gateway for microservice deployments. The next question which I can probably ask you is your experience with storage services on AWS. What AWS storage services have you used, or your experience with storage service? As far as storage is concerned, your primary focus should be object-based storage and block storage. For object-based storage, you want to dwell more on Amazon S3. And if you're talking about Amazon S3 simple storage service, there are a lot of key classes that can meet different storage patterns. We have that for frequently accessed data, we have that for infrequently accessed data, and we have that for long-term, the AWS Glacier storage, data that has long-term access patterns. And then for block store, we want to mention the AWS Elastic Block Storage, where we have ABS being able to be attached to EC2 instances. And equally for block store, we can have the Elastic File System. Now the EBS is for a single EC2 instance, but with the Elastic File System, you can configure multiple EC2 instances to access the data that is stored in your EFS drive. So for storage, we have the EFS, and of course an aggregation, a data warehousing technology which AWS has is the AWS Redshift. So Redshift pulls data from different data sources, S3, EBS, Kinesis, and a lot more, and it then warehouses that data which can be used for further data analysis. So those are the key services that you should focus first on. We have the AWS S3 for block store, and then the AWS EBS for block storage, and then we have the EFS for multiple EC2 block store instances, and then the AWS Redshift for data warehousing. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell for more of such interview tips. The last question is, how will you automate the deployment of infrastructure or updating deployed infrastructure on the AWS cloud? The very first thing that should come to your mind as far as automatic deployment of infrastructure, especially as code on the AWS cloud, is the AWS Cloud Formation service. So AWS Cloud Formation helps you to perform infrastructure as code on the AWS cloud platform. Of course, you can also mention the usage of AWS config to manage configurations on the cloud or infrastructure, but AWS Cloud Formation helps you to automatically provision and decommission infrastructure on the AWS cloud with code, where you can easily write your Cloud Formation templates that specify different resources that will be created when you apply such Cloud Formation templates. So that's a list of some of the common AWS questions that you can be asked during interviews. If you are not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and if you're a returning subscriber, thank you for subscribing to our videos. Of course, we are producing a lot more videos to help you to stay relevant in your cloud computing journey. And join the Slack community with the link in the description. Hit the notification bell so that every time we have a similar video, you will have access to these videos firsthand. See you in the next video.